Many moons ago, I spent 3 happy years studying for an undergraduate degree in theology. It involved a fabulous range of subjects and disciplines, including ethics, literature and philosophy, and church history from the early fathers to biblical Hebrew and Greek, and well beyond the Protestant Reformation. It should come as no surprise that I also spent a great deal of time poring over the Bible. My almost constant companion was a hefty tome called the New Jerome Biblical Commentary. Written by the American biblical scholar Raymond Brown, this truly impressive work was a line-by-line, verse-by-verse commentary on the entire Bible, encompassing both Old and New Testaments. As a critical explanation of Bible text, or exegesis, if you'll allow me a big word, Jerome was a godsend and saved many budding theologians from making fools of themselves. The importance of this and other biblical commentaries is twofold. One, they present scholars with an academically sound introduction to the most important cultural, historical, literary and scientific elements found in scriptures. And secondly, a good commentary will also reflect exegetical variations or differences of opinion and interpretation within the community of scholars. The second reason for its importance is to help create religious orthodoxy. That is, it presents an approved version of a religion's foundational texts, be it the Talmud, Bible or Quran. In this lecture, we're going to look at Quranic exegesis or commentary that took place in the Islamic Golden Age from the year 750 until about 1258. And to better understand Quranic exegesis, we're going to consider the life and work of Muhammad ibn Jarir al-Tabari, one of the most important commentators of that or any other time in Islamic history. But to begin, we need to better understand what is meant by exegesis, and to consider both its purpose and importance. The Arabic word for exegesis is tafsir, and we'll refer to both terms, the English and the Arabic, in the course of this lecture. It would be helpful also to note here that although I'm obviously dealing with commentaries on the Quran, what I'm going to say about the use and importance of the commentaries broadly is the same for Muslim, Jewish and Christian theology. And indeed, the same for the religious texts held sacred by non-monotheistic religions as well. In his own day, al-Tabari lived under the threat of being lynched on more than one occasion. He was not one to shy away from stirring up dissent by speaking the truth as he saw it. So there were not infrequent clashes between al-Tabari and the followers of another school of Islamic law, established by a man named Ahmed ibn Hanbal. These confrontations would test the limits of intra-Muslim tolerance, and they have persisted. Al-Tabari's name has even been drawn into the very modern-day argument you might be familiar with, involving Salman Rushdie's novel The Satanic Verses. Now, if the idea of Quranic exegesis strikes you as somewhat dry, let's open this discussion with a human rather than a literary face. According to the official accounts of the Muslim prophet Muhammad's life story, the Quran was revealed to him over a period of 22 years, in the early 7th century. Muhammad, apart from being the conduit for these revelations, and for reciting them to his followers, was also responsible for explaining the revelations to the Muslim faithful. So what we can say here is that Muhammad should be considered the first exegete, that's someone who offers exegesis or commentary, written or otherwise. The Arabic term for an exegete is mufassir, one who explains or expounds. After Muhammad's death in 632, the task of offering commentary fell to his companions, people who knew him personally. We can think of these companions as being the second phase of Islamic exegesis. However, because Muhammad's companions typically only commented on the revelation of the Quran as recited by the Prophet, rather than giving their own interpretations, they're not exegetes in the traditional sense of the word. It was only in the generations that followed, when there was no longer anyone alive who'd known Muhammad personally, that Islamic exegesis really developed. It was during this third phase of tafsir that the Quran was fully interpreted, and that more personal opinions on everything from points of Arabic grammar to personal names and family ties and places mentioned were put down. And I should be absolutely clear here that just because something was recorded doesn't mean that it was universally accepted. It was a learned opinion which was open for others to reject or reinterpret for centuries to come, and indeed even down to the present day. And tafsir isn't the only literary source in Islam, nor is it the most important. That distinction, of course, goes to the Quran itself. Today, the vast majority of Muslims see the Quran as the revealed and uncreated, i.e. eternal, Word of God. The debate over whether the Quran should be considered created or uncreated was one that waxed and waned for centuries before the more orthodox view of it as uncreated, that is eternal, having always existed and to exist always, won the day. The counter-argument, that of the Quran as a created text, centered on the idea that God is eternal, and as such, surely the divine being must exist or come before its words. Thus, those who argued for a created or non-eternal Quran said the book must have come into existence after God. Alongside the Quran and tafsir, Islamic scholars and the Muslim faithful have two additional important literary sources at their disposal: the Hadith, or sayings and actions of Muhammad as heard or seen by companions and written down in his generation or the two after his death, and the Akhbar, or news, which refers to the accounts of the early community of Muslims, Muhammad's companions and others. Of these, the Quran has always had primacy. But after the Quran, it might be useful to think of tafsir as the most scholarly of the other Muslim sources. The primary purpose of exegesis is to explain and make clear the meaning of a text. Perhaps obviously, such an apparently simple definition conveys only a part of what exegesis involves. Among other things, there is the need to understand the historical setting in which particular words were set down, i.e., what they meant to the first readers in the particular historical context in which they lived. It also includes, but isn't limited to, providing definitions of unknown or uncommon Arabic words, explaining the meaning of particular verses, both the words on the page and any underlying or hidden meaning that may exist, such as one might find in a parable, a simple story used to illustrate a moral or spiritual message, as used by Jesus in the Gospels, and reconciling any verses that appear contradictory. As I mentioned at the outset, the most important role of exegesis is to help establish religious orthodoxy. Orthodoxy brings not only a semblance of order to religious belief, but also confers more than a little power on those who agree with and strive to uphold that orthodoxy. For this reason, it's easy to see just how important textual interpretation, or tafsir, is for Islamic orthodoxy, just as it is for Judaism and Christianity. And so we come to the life of al-Tabari, who worked during one of the most important eras for tafsir, some 200 years after the life of Muhammad. It was in this period that much of the most important work of writing and compiling commentaries took place, and when al-Tabari proved to be one of the most important and enduring names in the field. Muhammad ibn Jarir al-Tabari was born in 839. Apart from that single detail, perhaps the first thing of importance to say about him is that he was a Persian, not an Arab. He came from a province in northern Persia that borders the southern shores of the Caspian Sea. And his family name, al-Tabari, comes from the province of his birth, Tabaristan. So why is his being Persian important? Well, the Arab-Muslim conquest of Persia began in the decade after Muhammad's death, and virtually the whole of this ancient territory fell under the control of this new imperial and religious force by 650. But the Arab conquerors found themselves ruling over a sophisticated and prosperous civilization. To put it bluntly, although the Persians had just been defeated, their civilization was far superior to anything the recently arrived Arabs had to offer, in many respects, though not all. The Arabs' trump card was Islam and the language of the Quran and Islamic revelation, which is Arabic. Often, in the face of all evidence to the contrary, Arabic speakers saw themselves as natural superiors to non-Arabic speakers. One result was that any smart young man of al-Tabari's generation knew that to get on he'd have to learn Arabic, and not just a little of it. To succeed in a world where Arabic tribal identity was, in many cases, crucial to advancement, al-Tabari set out to be better at Arabic than the Arabs. The evidence tells us he was ultimately successful. The challenge of memorizing the Quran remains a popular one even today among young Muslims. It contains more than 77,000 Arabic words. That's about the length of a short novel and almost exactly the same size as the first Harry Potter book. Well, al-Tabari managed to memorize the Quran by the age of 7. He was a prayer leader a year later, and he left home to pursue more formal studies at the age of 12. In this respect, al-Tabari was lucky that his family was a wealthy one, with money flowing from rents on family landholdings at home in Tabaristan. This allowed him to be a gentleman scholar, devoting all of his time to learning. And it meant he never had to rely on patronage or mind what he said to keep a patron happy. As a teenager in the mid-850s, al-Tabari travelled to Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, and, at that time, still the most important centre of learning in the Islamic world. Al-Tabari went there to study under Ahmed ibn Hanbal, one of the most famous and highly regarded of all Sunni Muslim jurists, who had established a school of Islamic jurisprudence that was named after him, Hanbali. Al-Tabari, however, was too late, as Ibn Hanbal had died shortly before the young man's arrival. As we'll see shortly, however, this wouldn't be the end of al-Tabari's dealings with the Hanbali school. So, al-Tabari continued to travel widely, including to Syria and Egypt, and he met with local scholars wherever he went. This broadened his mind and gave him a wealth of material for the books he settled into writing. Al-Tabari was not only an intellectually curious man, he was also a born collector who accumulated mountains of material on his travels. And he would devote most of the rest of his life to distilling and publishing his thoughts on this material so that other scholars could make use of it before it was lost forever. The reader, al-Tabari wrote in the introduction to his Tafsir, should know that with respect to all I have mentioned and set down in this book of mine, I rely upon traditions and reports which have been transmitted and which I attribute to their transmitters. I rely only very rarely upon my rationality and internal thought processes. In other words, Al-Tabari was saying that he wasn't making things up, and that his record was as accurate as possible, within the framework of trusting ostensibly accurate and reliable chains of transmitters. As it turns out, countless texts he consulted are now lost to posterity, but he seems to have seen the value in everything, leaving no subject neglected that he deemed important. These invaluable sources included some of the earliest rulings on Islamic law, commentaries on the Quran and the sayings of Muhammad, and accounts from eyewitnesses at the dawn of Islam. One of the beauties of Al-Tabari's scholarship is his honesty. Al-Tabari comes across as a much more scrupulous author and compiler than some of his contemporaries. Of course, he had an agenda to produce Islamic exegesis, but he wasn't prepared to sacrifice this goal by indiscriminately leaving out opinions that didn't agree with his own. Perhaps it's because of his intellectual honesty that this became the standard work of tafsir by which all consequent works were judged. Had he been a polemicist instead of an exegete, his words might have been popular in their day, but they wouldn't have survived as works of scholarship. This book of mine, he allows us, may contain some information mentioned by me on the authority of certain men of the past, which the reader may disapprove of and the listener may find detestable, because he can find nothing sound and no real meaning in it. In such cases, the reader should know that it is not my fault that such information comes to him, but the fault of someone who transmitted it to me. I have merely reported it as it was reported to me. Al-Tabari's success as a scholar is validated by the fact that his tafsir, or exegesis, remains a central and standard text of Islamic commentary more than 1100 years later. How's that for a shelf life? So let's turn now to another remarkable work by Al-Tabari. Rather than Quranic exegesis, it's history, and viewed by many scholars as his most important work. Known in Arabic as Tariq al-Rasul wa al-Mulk, this translates in English as the history of the Prophet and the Kings. Al-Tabari completed it in the year 915, and it's remarkable for a number of reasons, two in particular. One, its scope or ambition, and two, its length. Rather than being written, it's more accurate to say it was compiled and edited. And rather than one man's view, this history of the Prophet and the Kings was a compilation of other people's writings. As audacious as it sounds, Al-Tabari's intention was to produce a history of the world from its creation through the Old Testament prophets and the Persian empires up through Muhammad's lifetime to his own day and life in the Abbasid Caliphate. Drawing on as many sources as were available to him, Al-Tabari worked chronologically and virtually without comment, allowing the words of the original authors to speak for themselves. Where he does comment, it's typically to raise a grammatical matter, to clarify the use of a particular word or phrase. From a Western perspective, it's interesting to note that Al-Tabari barely mentioned the Greeks and Romans, whom we typically place at the very heart of our historical past. But Al-Tabari is right that it's the Persians who are the more important force in the region, and it's their children, including Al-Tabari himself, who continued in Al-Tabari's lifetime to exert an important influence on the cultural and even religious life of the Middle East. This view from Baghdad by a native Persian has seen Al-Tabari accused by his critics of being partisan and biased. But rather than bias, I suspect it's more accurate to say that al-Tabari was writing from his own perspective and to his expertise. As for being a partisan writer, a good counter-argument is his inclusion of so many narrative accounts of the early days of Islam that show the first believers in a negative light. A prime example of this is found in the murder of Uthman, the third of the four Rashidun, or so-called rightly guided caliphs, after Muhammad. Long after al-Tabari's day, Uthman's murder remained a controversial issue, but al-Tabari was happy to produce accounts from different opinions as to what happened and why, even as they hardly depict the earliest Muslim community favourably. Furthermore, al-Tabari's history, and even more so his tafsir, relied on his skill at presenting clear linguistic definitions of Arabic words and phrases, and offering grammatical corrections to the original Arabic texts. This is especially notable when we recall that al-Tabari was not a native Arabic speaker, but rather a Persian. By and large, al-Tabari is the model of an unbiased scholar in allowing the texts to speak for themselves. For instance, where possible, al-Tabari liked to include two or more descriptions of the same occurrence. Sometimes these different accounts are in agreement, and often they're not, instead offering contradictory accounts of events. That doesn't matter to al-Tabari. He's not offering his blessing on these earlier writers and their accounts of history. Instead, his task, as he saw it, was to make the texts available to other educated readers, while he remained scrupulously neutral. Apart from allowing modern historians to look back at texts that are no longer available, al-Tabari's history forms a central component of how Muslim historians see the origins of their religious history. In a sense, this makes up an important plank in the narrative that encompasses the foundation myth, or the earliest sources dealing with Islamic world history. It really is an unparalleled collection of early texts, and it retains a great deal of value because al-Tabari was so conscientious in listing his sources, many of which, sadly, no longer exist, making his the sole extant authority. A few years ago, the State University of New York embarked on the ambitious project to translate the complete work. Several editors, numerous translators, and more than 20 years later, they completed the task. The complete edition runs to 40 volumes, including the introduction and index, and each volume is roughly 250 pages. There's no evidence that anyone but al-Tabari himself transcribed every entry, alone and without secretaries or students to help him. Indeed, there's a popular belief that al-Tabari wrote 40 pages a day through the 40 years that formed the bulk of his working life. Hugh Kennedy, a professor of Arabic and medieval history at the University of London, puts the importance of al-Tabari's work in perspective when he says, "In its majestic scope and fierce attention to details, Tabari's writing is one of the great monuments of world history." And he adds, "For all modern historians of the golden age of Islam, the writings of this pernickety old bachelor scholar remain the foundations of our understanding." Al-Tabari's history and his tafsir, which is only slightly shorter in scope, represents a prodigious feat of scholarship during al-Tabari's 86 years of life, until his death in Baghdad in the year 923. He clearly made best use of his time. As promised at the start of this lecture, I'm going to close by considering two controversies, one that took place in al-Tabari's lifetime and one in our own. So why, you might ask, am I ending a lecture on al-Tabari and Quranic exegesis with controversy? The answer is for a very good reason. to reinforce what I've already said about the role of tafsir in offering commentary and establishing or promoting an orthodox voice against which others can be judged, favourably or otherwise. Al-Tabari, as a learned man, was not afraid to criticise others whose scholarship he found wanting. In Al-Tabari's view, opinion could never replace knowledge, and as he grew older, one of those he became increasingly critical of was Ahmed ibn Hanbal, the man under whom he'd hoped to study when he first travelled to Baghdad. The Hanbali school of Islamic law that Ibn Hanbal established after 800 AD is the one followed today by the Wahhabis, the branch of Sunni Islam prevalent in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and which outsiders sometimes categorize as ultra-orthodox and among the most uncompromising branches of Islam. But in Hanbal's own view, the Quran, along with the sayings and early traditions of Muhammad, were a sufficient basis of Islamic law. Al-Tabari disagreed, and he held that Hanbal wasn't truly able to make such a claim. For one thing, Al-Tabari didn't consider Hanbal sufficiently well versed in Islamic law or exegesis, two fields of scholarship in which Al-Tabari clearly excelled. Now, we should remember that Hanbal was dead by this time, and so it was his supporters who were responsible for defending him and making regular warnings to Al-Tabari. With a lynching threatened on more than one occasion, the authorities in Baghdad arranged a public debate so the two sides could argue their points of view. Al-Tabari accepted the challenge, while the Hanbali refused, preferring to attack Al-Tabari's house instead. Unhappy with yet another challenge by Al-Tabari to the memory of their founding father, this particular clash highlighted the limits of religious tolerance on the part of certain Hanbali during the 9th century, and speaks to the importance of tafsir and who defines the limits of its usefulness. So what about the satanic verses and Al-Tabari's role in this 20th century controversy that occasionally awakens even today in the 21st century? Salman Rushdie's novel was published in 1988 and attracted anger and violent responses from numbers of Muslims as far apart as India, Turkey and Britain. Most famously, perhaps, the Iranian Shia cleric Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa, or religious opinion, that the Western author and his publishers should be put to death for blasphemy against the Prophet Muhammad. The Satanic Verses fictional storyline recounts a conversation between Muhammad and the devil, with the devil tempting the Prophet. These verses don't actually appear in the Quran, though some Islamic scholars contend they were cut from the final text, which manuscript version was compiled under the third caliph, Uthman, or roughly 20 years after Muhammad's death. But fundamentalist defenders of the Quran hold an opposite view. Al-Tabari enters the argument because he himself quotes the controversial verses in his own history. Does this mean that he lends academic support to the novelistic satanic verses? Absolutely not. As we saw earlier, Al-Tabari was happy to present accounts both pro and con of the earliest Muslim community, usually offering no opinion as to their authenticity or veracity. But it seems that nobody recently has bothered to read the introduction to his book. Al-Tabari's words I quoted earlier were, "This book may contain some information which the reader may disapprove of and the listener may find detestable. In such cases, the reader should know that it is not my fault, but the fault of someone who transmitted it to me. I have merely reported it as it was reported to me." Many on both sides of the Salman Rushdie affair rushed to take Al-Tabari's work at face value, rather than understand that he was reporting, without prejudice, the words of others. the fact remains that no one since al-Tabari's time has had access to the wealth of sources he had. And so probably never again is it possible for anyone to compile as comprehensive a study of the early days of the Muslim Middle East. And the use or abuse of history and historical texts remains an important issue. Today, the vast majority of Muslims accept the Quran as a divinely revealed and uncreated, that is to say, eternal text, and not a created work that came into existence at a point in history. But debates about the meaning of the Quran are ongoing and vigorous. And with thousands of volumes of tafsir written since al-Tabari's day, his work is still considered the exemplar, consulted daily by Islamic scholars and scholars of Islam alike. With that, I hope anyone who thought at the start of this lecture that Quranic exegesis was dry and unimportant is now rethinking their opinion.